The distant wail of a train whistle cut through the morning air as Hannah Parker stood at the edge of her father's wheat field, her honey blonde hair whipping across her face in the Kansas wind of 1878. She squinted against the rising sun, taking in the vastness of their land once prosperous, now struggling under the weight of drought and her father's failing health. At 22, Hannah had watched helplessly as their farm slowly withered, like the crops that refused to thrive in the unforgiving soil. The doctor's words from yesterday still rang in her ears. "Your father needs rest, Miss Parker. Complete rest. No field work for at least 3 months." Those words might as well have been a death sentence for their farm. 3 months without tending the fields meant no harvest, which meant no money, which meant no food or medicine for the winter. Hannah clenched her fists, feeling the calluses that had formed over the past year as she tried to take on more of the farm work. But she was just one person, and the Parker wheat farm needed more hands than hers alone. "I won't lose this place," she whispered to the wind. "Not after everything Pa sacrificed." The sound of hoofbeats pulled her attention from the fields. A rider approached from the west, silhouetted against the morning sun. Hannah shaded her eyes, recognizing the broad shoulders and distinctive gait of Matthew Fletcher's Palomino stallion. The neighboring rancher had been nothing but trouble since arriving in Cottonwood Creek 2 years ago, buying up the old Johnson place and turning it into one of the most successful cattle operations in the county. Success, that came, some whispered, at the expense of smaller farmers like her father. Matthew Fletcher pulled his horse to a stop a few feet from her, his shadow falling across her face. At 30, he cut an imposing figure against the horizon, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair peeking out from under his well-worn Stetson, and eyes the color of a storm-darkened sky. "Miss Parker," he said, tipping his hat. His voice was deep, with the slightest hint of a southern drawl that seemed at odds with his otherwise straightforward manner. "I heard about your father. How's he doing?" Hannah straightened her spine. She didn't need Matthew Fletcher's pity or his questions. "He'll recover, Mr. Fletcher. Thank you for your concern." Matthew dismounted, his boots kicking up dust as he landed. He tied his horse to a fence post, then turned to survey the fields stretching out behind her. "Your wheat's looking thin this season." "We've had some challenges," she replied stiffly. The last thing she needed was for the successful rancher to see just how desperate their situation had become. "I imagine those challenges just got a whole lot bigger with your father laid up." He wasn't asking a question, just stating a fact they both knew to be true. Hannah's pride warred with her practicality. She needed help desperately, but asking this man felt like admitting defeat. Yet as she looked across the neglected fields, she realized she had no choice. "Your fields need hands, Miss Parker," Matthew said quietly, following her gaze. Hannah turned to him, surprised by the understanding in his voice. For a moment, something passed between them, something unexpected and unsettling. "Yes," she admitted. "They do." Matthew looked at her for a long moment, then out at the wheat again. The morning light caught in his eyes as he turned back to her. "My life needs yours more than wheat," he said, his voice so low she almost didn't catch the words. Hannah blinked, certain she'd misheard him. "I beg your pardon." A flush crept up his neck, and he cleared his throat. "I said, my men need work more than cattle right now. Spring calving's over, and we've got some hands I could spare to help get your place back in order." Hannah narrowed her eyes, searching his face for signs of mockery or ulterior motives. "Why would you help us? Everyone knows cattle ranchers and wheat farmers don't exactly see eye to eye in these parts." Matthew's expression softened just for a moment. "Because neighbors help neighbors, Miss Parker, even when they don't always agree." He paused, then added, And because your father's a good man who'd do the same if our situations were reversed." Hannah's throat tightened. As much as she wanted to refuse to tell him she could handle everything herself, she knew better. Without help, they'd lose everything. "We can't pay much," she said finally. "Not until the harvest." Matthew shook his head. "We'll work something out. Maybe your father can help with my books once he's feeling better. I've never had much head for figures." Hannah looked at him suspiciously. Matthew Fletcher was many things, but no one had ever accused him of being bad with numbers. His ranch's success was testament to that. "I'll send 3 men over tomorrow morning," he said, mounting his horse again. "They'll know what to do." "Mr. Fletcher," Hannah called as he prepared to ride away, "I don't understand why you're doing this." Matthew looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "Maybe I've got my reasons, Miss Parker." He tipped his hat. "Good day." Hannah watched him ride away, a strange feeling settling in her chest. She didn't trust Matthew Fletcher, not completely. But right now, his help was the only thing standing between her family and ruin. She turned back to the fields, wondering what price she'd eventually have to pay for accepting his assistance. The next morning, true to his word, 3 men arrived at the Parker farm just after sunrise. Hannah had been up since before dawn, preparing a large pot of coffee and some biscuits for the workers. When she heard the sound of horses approaching, she stepped out onto the front porch, wiping her hands on her apron. The men who dismounted in her yard were a diverse group, one older with gray streaking his beard, one middle-aged with the weathered face of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors, and one who couldn't be much older than 20. All 3 touched the brims of their hats respectfully. "Miss Parker," the older man said, "I'm Jim Holloway, Mr. Fletcher's foreman. This here's Carlos Rodriguez and young Billy Turner. Mr. Fletcher sent us to help with your fields." Hannah nodded. "I appreciate you coming. There's coffee and biscuits in the kitchen if you'd like some before you start." Jim smiled. "That's mighty kind, but we had breakfast at the ranch. Mr. Fletcher said we should get to work right away the north field first," he mentioned. Hannah frowned. "Yes, that's right, but how did he know which field needed attention first?" Jim looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Fletcher rides out most mornings, says it helps him think. I reckon he's passed by your place a time or two and taken notice." The idea that Matthew Fletcher had been watching her farm closely enough to know which fields were in the most need was unsettling. What else had he noticed during those morning rides? "Well, I'll show you what needs doing," she said, stepping down from the porch. As they walked toward the fields, Billy, the youngest, fell into step beside her. "Mr. Fletcher said your pa's been sick, madam. My ma makes a tea with willow bark that helps with fever something fierce. I could bring some by tomorrow if you'd like." Hannah was touched by the offer. "That's very kind, Billy. My father would appreciate that." For the next several hours, Hannah worked alongside the men, showing them the particular needs of their wheat crop. They were cattle hands, not farmers, but they were strong and willing to learn. By midday, they'd accomplished more than Hannah could have done in 3 days on her own. When they broke for lunch, Hannah insisted they come inside to eat. She'd prepared a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and the last of their ham. As they ate, she took the opportunity to ask about their employer. "How long have you worked for Mr. Fletcher?" she asked Jim, passing him the cornbread. "Going on 2 years now," Jim replied. "Came with him from Texas when he bought this place." "And what brought him to Kansas?" Hannah tried to keep her tone casual. Jim and Carlos exchanged a look that Hannah couldn't quite interpret. "War changes a man," Jim said finally. "Mr. Fletcher fought for the Confederacy, though he wasn't much more than a boy at the time. Lost his family's ranch in Texas after. Worked his way back up from nothing." Hannah absorbed this information. She knew many families who'd lost everything in the war, but she'd never considered that Matthew Fletcher might be one of them. It didn't fit the image she had of the successful, somewhat arrogant rancher. "He's a fair boss," Carlos added, speaking up for the first time. His accent was slight but noticeable. "Pays well, treats us with respect. Not all ranchers would hire a Mexican." Hannah nodded, reflecting on this new perspective of Matthew Fletcher. "And he just decided to help us out of the goodness of his heart." Another look passed between the men. "Mr. Fletcher has his reasons," Jim said carefully, "but they are his to share, not mine." Hannah was about to press further when the sound of hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. She rose and went to the window, her heart inexplicably speeding up when she recognized Matthew Fletcher riding toward the house. "Speak of the devil," she murmured. Matthew dismounted smoothly, taking a moment to run a hand along his horse's neck before approaching the house. Hannah met him at the door before he could knock. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral, "I wasn't expecting to see you today." He removed his hat, revealing hair still damp with sweat. "Just wanted to check on my men, make sure they're being useful." Hannah opened the door wider. "They've been incredibly helpful. Would you like to come in for some lunch? There's plenty." Matthew hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." When he entered the kitchen, his men stood respectfully. "Boss," Jim acknowledged, "field's coming along nice. Should have the north section weeded and ready by tomorrow." "Good work," Matthew said, taking the seat Hannah offered. She served him a plate, aware of his eyes following her movements. "How's your father today?" Matthew asked as she sat down across from him. "Restless," Hannah admitted. "He doesn't like being confined to bed, but the doctor was firm." Matthew nodded. "Stubborn men make poor patients. My grandfather was the same way." An awkward silence fell over the table. The ranch hands finished their meals quickly, thanked Hannah for the food, and excused themselves to return to work, leaving her alone with Matthew. "You don't need to check on your men," Hannah said once they were gone. "They're doing fine work." Matthew looked down at his plate. "Maybe I wanted to check on you." The simple statement caught Hannah off guard. "I'm managing," she said stiffly. "I know you are." Matthew's voice was soft. "You're quite remarkable, Miss Parker." Hannah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Mr. Fletcher, Matthew," he interrupted. "Call me Matthew, please." Hannah met his gaze. "Why are you really helping us, Mr. Fletcher? And don't say it's because neighbors help neighbors. There's more to it than that." Matthew was silent for a long moment, studying her face. Then he sighed. "Your father came to see me last month. He offered to sell me your farm." Hannah felt as if the air had been knocked from her lungs. "He what?" "He was worried about you," Matthew continued gently. "Said his health was failing and he didn't want to leave you with a struggling farm and no one to help run it." "So you're helping us out of pity?" Hannah's voice cracked despite her effort to keep it steady. "No." Matthew's response was immediate and firm. "I refused his offer. I told him I didn't want his land." Hannah's confusion must have shown on her face because Matthew leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Your father has worked this land for 30 years. It's part of who he is, who you are. Taking it away would be wrong." He paused. "But that doesn't mean I can't help." Hannah was stunned. This was not the Matthew Fletcher she thought she knew. "I still don't understand why you would care." Matthew stood and walked to the window, looking out at the fields where his men worked. "My family lost everything after the war, not just our ranch, but our dignity, our place in the community." He turned back to her. "I know what it's like to watch something you love slip away. I wouldn't wish that on anyone, especially not." He stopped abruptly. "Especially not what?" Hannah prompted. Matthew's eyes met hers, and something in them made her breath catch. "Especially not someone like you, who cares so deeply for this place." Hannah had the distinct feeling he'd been about to say something else, but she didn't press. Instead, she rose and began clearing the table, needing a moment to process this new information. "Thank you for telling me about my father," she said finally. "He hadn't mentioned anything to me about selling." "He was trying to protect you," Matthew said. "That's what fathers do." Hannah nodded, emotion welling up unexpectedly. She turned away, not wanting Matthew to see the tears threatening to spill. "I should check on him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course." Matthew retrieved his hat. "I'll be back tomorrow to help with the irrigation trench in the west field. It needs repairing before the next rain." Hannah looked at him in surprise. "You don't need to work the fields yourself." A small smile played at the corners of Matthew's mouth. "Maybe I want to, Miss Parker." With that, he placed his hat on his head and stepped out into the sunlight, leaving Hannah with far more questions than answers about the enigmatic rancher. Over the next week, Matthew's men continued to work the Parker fields, and true to his word, Matthew himself appeared each day to lend a hand. Hannah found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, the way his shoulders moved as he dug irrigation trenches, the gentle manner in which he spoke to his horse, the respect his men showed him. It was becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile this Matthew Fletcher with the arrogant rancher she'd believed him to be. On the 5th day, Hannah brought lunch out to the fields. The summer sun beat down mercilessly, and she'd prepared a large jug of lemonade along with sandwiches. As she approached, she saw Matthew working alone at the far end of the field, his shirt clinging to his back with sweat. "You should take a break," she called as she drew closer, "before you collapse from heat exhaustion." Matthew straightened, wiping his brow with his forearm. "Is that concern I hear, Miss Parker?" Hannah rolled her eyes, handing him the canteen of lemonade. "It would be inconvenient to have to drag your unconscious body back to the house." Matthew laughed, a rich sound that Hannah realized she'd rarely heard before. "Always practical," he said, taking a long drink. When he lowered the canteen, his expression turned more serious. "How's your father today?" "Better," Hannah said, surprised by the genuine interest in his voice. "The fever's gone, and he managed to eat a proper breakfast this morning." "That's good news." Matthew's smile seemed to light up his entire face, transforming his usually stern features. Hannah found herself smiling back. "Yes, it is." They stood in silence for a moment, the summer heat pressing down around them. Hannah was suddenly very aware of how close they were standing, of the thin material of her cotton dress sticking to her skin, of the way Matthew's eyes seemed to take in every detail of her face. "Your men seem to think very highly of you," she said, desperate to break the tension that had inexplicably developed. Matthew's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You've been asking about me." Hannah felt her cheeks grow warm. "I was curious about the man who suddenly decided to save our farm." "Is that what I'm doing?" Matthew's voice was soft. "Saving your farm," Hannah met his gaze, "isn't it?" Matthew looked away across the fields that stretched toward the horizon. "Maybe I'm just being selfish." "Selfish?" Hannah couldn't hide her confusion. "How is helping us selfish?" Matthew was quiet for so long that Hannah thought he might not answer. Then, still looking at the distant fields, he said, "Because it gives me a reason to see you every day." Hannah's heart seemed to stutter in her chest. Before she could form a response, Matthew turned back to her, his expression once again carefully neutral. "I should get back to work," he said. "Thank you for the lemonade." Hannah watched him return to his task, her mind whirling with implications. Had Matthew Fletcher just admitted to having feelings for her? And if he had, what did that mean for her, for them? That evening, as Hannah prepared dinner, she heard her father's footsteps on the stairs. She rushed to the hallway, alarmed to see him making his way down, one hand gripping the banister tightly. "Pa, what are you doing out of bed?" She hurried to his side, slipping an arm around his waist for support. George Parker was a shadow of his former self, once robust and hardy, now thin and pale after weeks of illness. But his eyes still held the same determination Hannah had inherited. "Can't stay in that bed another minute," he grumbled, leaning heavily on his daughter. "Need to see the fields with my own eyes." Hannah helped him to a chair at the kitchen table. "The fields are fine, Pa. Better than fine, actually. Mr. Fletcher's men have been a tremendous help." At the mention of Matthew's name, George's expression turned wary. "Fletcher's men? What's he want in return?" Hannah poured her father a cup of tea, avoiding his gaze. "Nothing. He says it's just neighbors helping neighbors," George snorted. "Matthew Fletcher doesn't do anything without a reason. Man's too smart for that." "He told me you offered to sell him our farm," Hannah said quietly, finally meeting her father's eyes. "Is that true?" George's face fell. "He told you that, did he?" He sighed heavily. "Yes, it's true. I was worried, Hannah. My health isn't getting any better, and this farm is too much for you to manage alone. So you decided to sell our home without even discussing it with me." Hannah couldn't keep the hurt from her voice. "I was trying to protect you," George insisted. "Fletcher's got money, resources. He could take care of this place, take care of you." "I don't need taking care of," Hannah replied firmly. "And this is my home too. I deserve to be part of that decision." George reached across the table to take her hand. "You're right. I'm sorry, daughter. I was scared, still am. The thought of leaving you alone to struggle with this place." "I'm not alone," Hannah said, squeezing his hand. "I have you, and apparently I have Matthew Fletcher too." George studied her face. "You called him Matthew just now." Hannah felt her cheeks warm. "Mr. Fletcher," she corrected herself. A knowing look crossed her father's face. "Be careful with that one, Hannah. He's a good man at heart, I believe that, but he's got ghosts that follow him." "What do you mean?" Hannah asked. George shook his head. "Not my story to tell. But if you're starting to care for him, you should know there's more to Matthew Fletcher than meets the eye." Before Hannah could press for details, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. She rose to answer it, surprised to find Matthew standing on their porch, hat in hand. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance after a long day's work, "this is unexpected." "I apologize for the late hour," he said, "but I wanted to bring this by." He held out a small burlap sack. "Seeds for the south field. They're a hardier strain of wheat, might do better in this soil." "Thank you," Hannah said, taking the bag. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, sending an unexpected jolt through her. "Matthew Fletcher," her father's voice called from behind her. "About time you showed your face in my house instead of just sending your men to do your bidding." Hannah turned to see her father standing in the doorway to the kitchen, leaning against the frame for support. "Mr. Parker," Matthew said, nodding respectfully. "Good to see you on your feet." "No thanks to this stubborn daughter of mine who'd keep me bedridden for a year if the doctor said so," George replied with a hint of a smile. "Come in, man. No sense standing on the porch like a stranger." Hannah stepped aside, allowing Matthew to enter. He moved past her, the scent of sun-warmed leather and something distinctly masculine lingering in his wake. "Can I offer you some coffee, Mr. Fletcher?" Hannah asked, falling back on politeness to mask her sudden nervousness. "Matthew," he corrected gently. "And yes, coffee would be welcome." As Hannah busied herself at the stove, she could hear her father and Matthew talking in low tones. When she returned with the coffee, they were discussing cattle prices, the conversation surprisingly amicable given the traditional tension between cattle ranchers and wheat farmers. "You've done good work on our fields," George said, accepting a cup from Hannah. "My daughter tells me you've been generous with your time and your men." Matthew shrugged, seemingly uncomfortable with the praise. "It was the right thing to do." George eyed him over the rim of his cup. "And the only thing," the The question hung in the air, its meaning clear to all three of them. Hannah held her breath, waiting for Matthew's response. Matthew's gaze shifted to Hannah for a brief moment before returning to her father. "No," he said simply, "not the only thing." The admission, though vague, sent Hannah's heart racing. George nodded as if this answer confirmed something he already suspected. "Well," he said, setting down his cup with a decisive clink, "I think I'll turn in. Doctor says I need my rest after all." He rose slowly, waving away Hannah's attempt to help him. "I can manage the stairs, daughter. Stay and keep Mr. Fletcher company." After her father had gone, an awkward silence fell between Hannah and Matthew. She busied herself collecting the empty cups, aware of his eyes following her movements. "Your father seems to be recovering well," Matthew said finally. Hannah nodded. "Yes, though he's still weak. It will be some time before he can work the fields again." "My offer of help stands as long as you need it," Matthew assured her. Hannah set the cups in the basin and turned to face him. "Why?" she asked, echoing the question her father had posed. "What's the not only thing, Matthew?" Matthew stood, closing the distance between them with a few steps. In the small kitchen, his presence seemed to fill the entire space. "I think you know," he said, his voice low. Hannah's heart thundered in her chest. "I'd rather you say it." Matthew reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she remained still, he gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "From the moment I saw you standing in that field, glaring at me like I was the devil himself," he said with a small smile, "I knew you were different, strong, stubborn, beautiful." Hannah's breath caught at the naked honesty in his eyes. "I didn't plan this," he continued. "God knows a wheat farmer's daughter is the last woman I should be falling for, but here we are." "Falling for," Hannah repeated, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Matthew's hand cupped her cheek fully now. "I'm in love with you, Hannah Parker. Have been for months, watching you from afar, too stubborn and prideful to admit it even to myself." Hannah felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. This confession was the last thing she'd expected when Matthew Fletcher had ridden onto their farm a week ago. "You barely know me," she whispered. "I know enough," he replied. "I know you love this land with every fiber of your being. I know you'd work yourself to the bone before asking for help. I know you're kind to my men and devoted to your father." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "And I know I want the chance to learn everything else about you." Hannah closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. A week ago, she'd thought him arrogant and calculating. Now, "You don't have to say anything," Matthew said, misinterpreting her silence. He began to withdraw his hand, but Hannah caught it, holding it against her cheek. "I don't know what I feel," she admitted. "Everything's happening so fast." Matthew nodded. "I understand. Take all the time you need." He stepped back, reclaiming his hat from the table. "I should go. It's getting late." Hannah walked him to the door, 1,000 unspoken words hovering between them. At the threshold, Matthew turned to her one last time. "Regardless of what you decide, Hannah, my help with your farm comes with no strings attached. I want you to know that." Hannah nodded, believing him despite her lingering doubts. "Thank you, Matthew." He tipped his hat and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Hannah to ponder how completely her world had changed in just one short week. The next morning dawned clear and hot, promising another scorching summer day. Hannah rose early, her sleep having been fitful at best after Matthew's unexpected declaration. She moved through her morning chores mechanically, her mind still turning over his words. The sound of approaching horses pulled her from her thoughts. She stepped out onto the porch, expecting to see Jim and the other ranch hands. Instead, she was met with the sight of 3 unfamiliar men riding toward the house. Something about their demeanor immediately set her on edge. The leader, a heavy-set man with a bushy red beard, reined his horse to a stop in the yard. His companions, a wiry youth with a pockmarked face and an older man with a scar running down his cheek, flanked him. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Hannah called, one hand on the doorframe, ready to retreat inside if necessary. "Hope so, madam," the leader said, tipping his hat with exaggerated politeness. "Name's Horace Wilkins. These are my associates, Ned and Tom. We represent the Blackwater Land Company." Hannah frowned. "I've never heard of Blackwater Land Company. We're new to these parts," Wilkins explained. "Buying up farms and ranches for investors back east. Heard your place might be available." A chill ran down Hannah's spine despite the morning heat. "You heard wrong, Mr. Wilkins. Our farm is not for sale." Wilkins dismounted, approaching the porch with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Now, that's not what we heard, Miss Parker. Word is your daddy's sick and you're struggling to keep this place afloat." Hannah straightened her spine. "Whatever you've heard, you heard wrong. Now, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave our property." Wilkins's smile faded. "Don't be hasty, girl. We're prepared to make a generous offer, more than fair considering the state of your fields." "The answer is no," Hannah said firmly. "Good day, gentlemen." She turned to go inside, but Wilkins's next words stopped her. "Your pa already took our money, girl." Hannah whirled around. "What did you say?" Wilkins pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Got it right here. Deposit agreement signed by George Parker 3 weeks ago. $500 down payment, with the remainder due upon transfer of the deed." Hannah snatched the paper from his hand, her eyes scanning the document in disbelief. There, at the bottom, was what appeared to be her father's signature. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice shaking. "Or a forgery. My father would never sell without telling me." "Seems he did," Wilkins said with a shrug. "Look, we understand this is a shock. That's why we're willing to give you 2 weeks to get your affairs in order before we take possession. Generous, if you ask me." "Get off our property," Hannah demanded, her hand trembling as she held the document. "Now." Wilkins's expression hardened. "You'd best talk to your pa, girl. We'll be back tomorrow for a proper answer." He looked past her to the house. "And tell him no refunds on that deposit. Deal's a deal." The 3 men mounted their horses and rode away, leaving Hannah standing on the porch, the damning document clutched in her hand. As soon as they were out of sight, she rushed inside and up the stairs to her father's bedroom. George was sitting up in bed, reading a worn copy of the Bible. He looked up as Hannah burst into the room, his expression changing to alarm when he saw her face. "Hannah, what's wrong?" She thrust the paper toward him. "Did you sell our farm?" "To someone called Blackwater Land Company." George took the document, confusion etched across his features. As he read, his face paled. "This isn't right," he muttered. "I never signed this." "3 men just showed up claiming you did," Hannah said. "That you took a $500 deposit." George shook his head vehemently. "I'd never sell to some company I'd never heard of, and certainly not without discussing it with you first." He examined the signature closely. "This looks like my hand, but I swear to you, Hannah, I did not sign this paper." Hannah believed him. For all his faults, her father had never lied to her. "Then we're being swindled," she said, taking the paper back. "They said they're returning tomorrow for a proper answer." George's expression turned grim. "We need the sheriff." "And a lawyer," Hannah added. "I'll ride into town right away." As she turned to go, George caught her hand. "Wait. What about Fletcher? His men are due here this morning, aren't they?" Hannah hesitated. After last night's conversation, facing Matthew was the last thing she wanted to do, but her father was right, they needed all the help they could get. "I'll speak with him first," she decided. "Then go to town." She didn't have to wait long. Less than an hour later, The now familiar sound of Matthew's men arriving reached her ears. She stepped outside to find not just Jim, Carlos, and Billy, but Matthew himself, leading the group. One look at her face and Matthew dismounted quickly, crossing to her in long strides. "What's happened?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. Hannah explained the situation as the ranch hands listened in growing outrage. When she finished, Matthew's expression was thunderous. "Blackwater," he spat the name. "They've been buying up land all through the territory. Their methods aren't always above board." "You know them?" Hannah asked, surprised. Matthew nodded grimly. "They tried to buy my ranch last year. When I refused, I had a mysterious fire in one of my barns." Nothing could be proven, of course. A chill ran through Hannah at the implication. "You think they'd resort to violence?" "I think they're not men to be trifled with," Matthew said carefully. "Jim, you and the boys stay here with Miss Parker and her father. I'm riding into town with her to see the sheriff." "That's not necessary," Hannah protested. "I can manage on my own." Matthew's eyes met hers, his gaze unwavering. "I know you can, but you don't have to." The simple statement, devoid of any condescension, disarmed her. Hannah nodded her acceptance, then went inside to prepare for the trip to town. 20 minutes later, she and Matthew were riding side by side toward Cottonwood Creek, the morning sun climbing higher in the sky. They traveled in companionable silence for a while, until Matthew spoke. "About last night," he began, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I hope I didn't make you uncomfortable." Hannah kept her gaze forward as well. "You surprised me," she admitted. "I never thought you that we," she struggled to find the right words. "That a cattle rancher and a wheat farmer's daughter could find common ground," Matthew suggested with a small smile. Hannah returned the smile despite herself. "Something like that." "For what it's worth," Matthew said, "I meant what I said, but I understand if you don't feel the same way. Or if you need time." Hannah looked at him then, taking in his profile against the blue sky. "I do need time," she said honestly. "Everything's happening so quickly. This business with Blackwater, my father's health, the farm." She trailed off. Matthew nodded. "Time you shall have. In the meantime, we'll sort out this Blackwater situation." The rest of the journey passed quickly as they discussed potential strategies for dealing with the land company. By the time they reached Cottonwood Creek, Hannah was struck by how easily they worked together, how naturally their minds seemed to complement each other. The sheriff's office was a small wooden building on the main street of town. Sheriff Miller was a practical man in his 50s, with a graying mustache and shrewd eyes that had seen their share of frontier justice. He listened to their story without interruption, examining the document Hannah provided. "This is troubling," he said finally. "But without proof the signature is forged, it's your father's word against theirs, and they have a signed document." "So you're saying there's nothing you can do?" Hannah asked, frustration evident in her voice. The sheriff sighed. "I can have a word with these Blackwater fellows, make it clear that any strong-arm tactics won't be tolerated in my town. But as for the contract itself, that's a matter for the courts." Matthew leaned forward. "What if we could prove they've done this before?" "Forged signatures pressured landowners." Sheriff Miller stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "That would certainly help. You have evidence of such activities?" "Not yet," Matthew admitted. "But I've heard rumors. If Hannah and I could gather testimonies from other landowners in the area." "It would be a start," the sheriff agreed. "But courts move slow, and it sounds like these Blackwater fellows are moving fast." After leaving the sheriff's office, Hannah and Matthew visited the town's only lawyer, a young man named Richard Thompson, who had recently established his practice in Cottonwood Creek. His advice was similar to the sheriff's. Without clear evidence of forgery or fraud, the contract would be difficult to contest. I can file an injunction to prevent them from taking possession while we investigate, Thompson offered, but I'll need a retainer of $50. Hannah's heart sank. They barely had $10 to their name at present, with all their hopes pinned on the coming harvest. I'll cover it, Matthew said, reaching for his wallet. No, Hannah said firmly. This is our fight. Matthew turned to her, his expression serious. Hannah, let me help. Not because you can't manage on your own, but because you shouldn't have to. Their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Hannah nodded, recognizing the practicality of accepting his assistance. As they left the lawyer's office, Matthew suggested they visit the mercantile to gather supplies before returning to the farm. Hannah agreed, though her mind was still whirling with worry over the Blackwater situation. Inside the mercantile, Hannah moved through the aisles mechanically, selecting flour, coffee, and other necessities. As she examined a bolt of fabric, considering whether they could afford new curtains for the kitchen, she overheard a conversation between two women on the other side of the store. Heard they did the same to the Wilsons over in Harper County, one woman was saying. Claimed Mr. Wilson signed over his land, but Martha swears he never did. Hannah froze, then quickly moved closer to the women. Excuse me, she said. Were you talking about the Blackwater Land Company? The women exchanged glances. Yes, the older one said cautiously. Why do you ask? They've approached my father about our farm, Hannah explained. We think they forged his signature on a contract. The women's expressions turned sympathetic. That's exactly what happened to the Wilsons, the younger woman said, and the Bergers before them. You know where I might find Mrs. Wilson? Hannah asked, hope flaring in her chest. The older woman nodded. Martha's staying with her sister just outside of town since they lost their place. The Jensen farm, about 3 miles east. Hannah thanked them and hurried to find Matthew, who was settling their bill with the shopkeeper. She quickly explained what she'd overheard. This could be exactly what we need, Matthew said, his eyes lighting up. If we can gather enough testimonies from people who have been similarly deceived. We should go to the Jensen farm immediately, Hannah urged. Matthew agreed, and after loading their supplies onto their horses, they set out for the Jensen property. The farm was modest but well kept, with a neat white farmhouse and several outbuildings. As they approached, a woman in her 40s emerged onto the porch, regarding them warily. Mrs. Wilson, Hannah called as they dismounted. My name is Hannah Parker. This is Matthew Fletcher. We were hoping to speak with you about Blackwater Land Company. At the mention of Blackwater, Martha Wilson's expression hardened. What about them? She asked, her voice tight with barely contained anger. They're trying to take my family's farm, Hannah explained. They claim to have a contract signed by my father, but he insists he never signed anything. We heard something similar happened to you. The tension in Martha's shoulders eased slightly. You'd better come in, she said, opening the door wider. Inside, over cups of strong tea, Martha shared her story. It was distressingly similar to Hannah's 3 men arriving at their farm, producing a document allegedly signed by her husband, demanding they vacate the property. Thomas swore he never signed anything, Martha said, twisting her wedding band. But they had his signature plain as day on that paper. When we refused to leave, strange things started happening. Our well was poisoned. Someone cut our fence lines. Then one night our barn caught fire. Hannah exchanged a glance with Matthew, remembering what he'd said about his own barn fire. The sheriff in our county wasn't much help, Martha continued. Said without proof, it was just our word against theirs. 2 weeks later, they showed up with the deed and the sheriff, saying we had to leave. Her voice cracked. 30 years on that land, gone just like that. Where is your husband now? Matthew asked gently, Martha's eyes filled with tears. He had a stroke the day after we were forced out. He's in the county hospital, can't speak, can't move his right side. Hannah reached across the table, taking Martha's hand in hers. I'm so sorry. Martha squeezed her hand gratefully. What can I do to help you? I won't let them do to another family what they did to mine. Would you be willing to make a sworn statement about what happened? Matthew asked. And perhaps introduce us to others who have had similar experiences with Blackwater. Martha's expression turned resolute. I can do better than that. There's a meeting tomorrow night at the church in Millsville. Folks from all over the county who have been cheated by Blackwater. We've been trying to get the territorial governor to investigate, but so far, no luck. Hannah felt a surge of hope. We'll be there, she promised. As they rode back toward the Parker farm, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the prairie, Hannah found herself glancing at Matthew, seeing him in a new light. The way he'd listened to Martha Wilson, the genuine compassion in his eyes, the determination to help not just Hannah's family but others who'd been wronged, it revealed a depth of character she hadn't fully appreciated before. Thank you, she said suddenly. Matthew looked at her questioningly. For everything, Hannah clarified. For helping with the farm, for coming with me today, for caring about people you don't even know. A smile played at the corners of Matthew's mouth. Is it so surprising that I might be a decent human being? Hannah laughed softly. I suppose I had you all wrong. I thought you were just another arrogant rancher looking to expand your holdings at the expense of smaller farmers. And now? Matthew asked, his voice casual though his eyes were intent on her face. Hannah considered her answer carefully. Now I think you might be the kind of man I could. She trailed off, suddenly shy. Could what? Matthew prompted, guiding his horse closer to hers. Hannah met his gaze. The kind of man I could fall in love with given time. The admission hung in the air between them, as tangible as the dust kicked up by their horses' hooves. Matthew's expression softened, his eyes filled with a warmth that made Hannah's heart race. Time, he repeated. That's something I'm happy to give you, Hannah Parker, as much as you need. The moment was interrupted by the sound of gunfire in the distance coming from the direction of the Parker farm. Hannah's blood ran cold. Without a word, she and Matthew spurred their horses to a gallop, racing toward the sound. As they crested the final hill, Hannah's worst fears were confirmed. Smoke rose from one of their outbuildings, and several men on horseback were circling the main house. Even from a distance, she recognized the red, bearded figure of Horace Wilkins. My father, Hannah gasped, panic rising in her throat. Jim and the others are there, Matthew reminded her, though his own expression was grim. They won't let any harm come to him. They approached cautiously, keeping to the tree line that bordered the eastern edge of the property. As they drew closer, Hannah could see Jim and Carlos positioned on the porch of the main house, rifles in hand. Her father was nowhere in sight, presumably safely inside. Matthew motioned for Hannah to dismount and stay hidden. I'll circle around to the west, he whispered. When I fire a shot in the air, I want you to ride straight for the house. Don't stop for anything, understand? Hannah nodded, her mouth dry with fear. Matthew squeezed her shoulder reassuringly, then disappeared into the trees, leading his horse quietly away from their position. Hannah counted the seconds, her heart pounding in her ears. The Blackwater men continued to circle the house, occasionally shouting threats that the wind carried away before she could make out the words. The small storage shed at the edge of the yard was fully engulfed in flames now, but thankfully, it contained nothing of value, just some old tools and empty grain sacks. Finally, a shot rang out from the western edge of the property. Taking her cue, Hannah mounted her horse and burst from the tree line, riding hard for the house. She heard shouts of surprise from the Blackwater men, but none of them fired at her, perhaps unwilling to shoot a woman. Jim spotted her approach and covered her as she reached the porch, practically diving from her horse to reach the safety of the house. Inside, she found her father seated in his armchair, a shotgun across his lap, his face pale but determined. "Hannah," he exclaimed as she rushed to embrace him. "Thank God you're safe. Are you all right?" she asked, checking him for injuries. "I'm fine," he assured her. "These scoundrels showed up about an hour ago demanding we vacate immediately. When I refused, they set fire to the shed as a warning." A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, Hannah saw Matthew riding boldly into the yard, his rifle raised but not aimed at anyone in particular. He pulled his horse to a stop in the center of the yard. "Wilkins," he called, his voice carrying clearly through the open window. "This has gone far enough." Horace Wilkins guided his horse closer to Matthew, his men spreading out behind him. "Fletcher," he acknowledged with a sneer, "this ain't your fight." "You made it my fight when you trespassed on property under my protection," Matthew replied evenly. Wilkins laughed. "Protection? You playing knight in shining armor for the Parker girl." His voice turned mocking. "Awful lot of trouble for a piece of wheat land." "It's not about the land," Matthew said, his voice hard. "It's about right and wrong, and forging signatures on land contracts is decidedly wrong." A flicker of unease crossed Wilkins's face. "Don't know what you're talking about, Fletcher." "I think you do," Matthew countered. "Just like you know about the Wilsons in Harper County and the Bergers before them. How many families have you cheated, Wilkins?" Hannah could see the tension in Wilkins's posture even from a distance. He leaned forward in his saddle. "Careful, Fletcher. Accusations like that could get a man killed in these parts." "Is that a threat?" Matthew's voice remained steady, but Hannah could see his hand tighten on his rifle. "Just stating facts," Wilkins replied. "Now we have a legal contract with George Parker. You'd best stay out of business that don't concern you." "Forgery concerns me," Matthew said. "And it'll concern the territorial governor too once he hears about your operation." This seemed to give Wilkins pause. "What are you talking about?" "There's a meeting tomorrow night," Matthew informed him. "Folks from all over the county who claim Blackwater forged their signatures or pressured them illegally. The governor's representative will be there, along with a federal marshal." Hannah wasn't sure if Matthew was bluffing about the governor's representative and the marshal, but his words had the desired effect. Wilkins and his men exchanged uneasy glances. "You're lying," Wilkins said, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. Matthew shrugged. "Guess you'll find out tomorrow. In the meantime, I suggest you leave this property before the sheriff arrives. I sent one of my men to fetch him before I approached." It was a standoff, tension crackling in the air like the flames that still consumed the storage shed. Finally, Wilkins spat on the ground. "This ain't over, Fletcher," he growled. "Not by a long shot." With that, he wheeled his horse around and signaled to his men. They rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving the yard eerily quiet in their wake. Hannah rushed outside as soon as they were gone, running to where Matthew still sat on his horse, watching the retreating figures. He dismounted as she approached, and without thinking, Hannah threw her arms around him. "That was either very brave or very foolish," she said against his chest. Matthew's arms came around her, holding her close. "Probably a bit of both," he admitted, his voice rumbling beneath her ear. Hannah pulled back to look up at him. "Were you telling the truth?" "About the governor's representative and the marshal," a small smile played at Matthew's lips. "Not entirely. But Martha did mention trying to get the governor involved, and it seemed like a good way to buy us some time. Do you think they'll be back?" Hannah asked, glancing in the direction the Blackwater men had disappeared. Matthew's expression turned serious. "Eventually, Men like that don't give up easily, but we'll be ready for them. Jim approached them, his rifle still in hand. Boss, we should get that fire under control before it spreads. Matthew nodded, reluctantly releasing Hannah. Organize a bucket line. I'll check on Mr. Parker. As Matthew headed for the house, Hannah caught Jim's arm. Thank you for protecting my father, she said sincerely. Jim touched the brim of his hat. Just doing what the boss asked, miss. Though truth be told, we'd have done it anyway. Your pa's a good man. Hannah helped with the bucket line, passing water from the well to douse the remaining flames of the storage shed. By the time they had the fire completely extinguished, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the farm. Inside the house, Hannah found Matthew and her father deep in conversation at the kitchen table, a map spread out between them. The meeting in Millsville is our best chance, Matthew was saying as Hannah entered. If we can gather enough testimonies, present a united front. But will it be enough? George asked, his voice weary. These Blackwater fellows seem well connected. They're bullies, Matthew replied firmly. And bullies typically fold when confronted with enough resistance. Besides, I've sent a telegram to a friend in Topeka who works for the land office. He might have information about Blackwater's operations that could help us. Hannah set a pot of coffee on the stove. You have friends in the territorial land office, she asked, surprised yet again by Matthew's connections. Matthew smiled slightly. Adam Miller. We served together in the war, ended up on opposite sides but reconciled afterward. He's been helpful in navigating the red tape for my ranch. As Hannah prepared a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, she listened to Matthew and her father continue to strategize. There was something comforting about their collaborative planning, about the way Matthew treated her father as an equal partner despite his weakened state. After dinner, Matthew rose to leave, needing to return to his ranch to organize his affairs before the meeting in Millsville the following evening. Hannah walked him to the porch, where the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Will you be all right tonight? Matthew asked, his concern evident. I can leave Jim and Carlos here if you'd feel safer. Hannah considered the offer. I think we'll be fine. I doubt Wilkins will return so soon, and my father and I both know how to use a rifle. Matthew nodded, though he still looked worried. I'll be back at first light, he promised. We'll ride to Millsville together. He started to turn toward his horse, then hesitated. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he reached out and took her hand in his. His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm, sending shivers up her arm. Hannah, he said softly, I know this isn't the time or place, but I need you to know whatever happens with Blackwater, whatever you decide about us, I'm not going anywhere. I'll stand by you through this. Hannah looked up at him, at the sincerity in his storm-gray eyes, and something shifted inside her. The walls she'd built around her heart, walls of independence, of wariness, of old prejudices about cattle, ranchers, began to crumble. Matthew, she whispered, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. I'm beginning to think I don't need as much time as I thought. The hope that dawned in his eyes nearly took her breath away. Moving with deliberate slowness, he leaned down, giving her every opportunity to step back. But Hannah found herself rising on her tiptoes, meeting him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, a question asked and answered in the press of lips. Matthew's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch as light as a butterfly's wing. When they pulled apart, both were breathing a little faster than before. I should go, Matthew said, his voice husky, before I forget all my good intentions. Hannah smiled, feeling a new kind of warmth spreading through her. Tomorrow, then. Tomorrow, he agreed, touching her cheek one last time before mounting his horse and riding into the gathering darkness. Hannah watched until he disappeared from sight, her fingers touching her lips where the memory of his kiss still lingered. Whatever tomorrow brought Blackwater, the meeting in Millsville, the uncertain future of their farm, she would face it with new strength, knowing she no longer stood alone. The night passed without incident, though Hannah slept fitfully, her mind filled with thoughts of Matthew, Blackwater, and the precarious state of their farm. She rose before dawn, checking on her father before starting the morning chores. To her surprise, she found him already dressed and seated at the kitchen table, looking stronger than he had in weeks. "You should be resting," she admonished gently, moving to the stove to start coffee. "Done enough resting," George replied. "Time I started pulling my weight again." He eyed her with a knowing look. "Besides, seems I've got a cattle rancher to impress now." Hannah felt her cheeks warm. "I don't know what you mean," George chuckled. "I wasn't born yesterday, daughter. I saw the way you two looked at each other." His expression softened. "He's a good man, Hannah. Better than I gave him credit for initially." Hannah busied herself with measuring coffee grounds. "It's complicated, Pa, with everything happening with Blackwater and the farm." "Life's always complicated," George said philosophically. "Doesn't mean you put happiness on hold waiting for perfect circumstances." He paused. "Your mother and I married during the worst drought Kansas had seen in 50 years. Everyone said we were fools, that we should wait for better times." A wistful smile crossed his face. "But we knew better times would come easier if we faced the hard ones together." Hannah turned to look at her father, touched by this rare mention of her mother who had died when Hannah was just 10. "You never told me that before," George shrugged. "Never seemed relevant until now." The sound of hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Hannah moved to the window, relieved to see Matthew riding into the yard, right on time as promised. "He's here," she said, smoothing her hair self-consciously. George watched her with amusement. "Better let him in, then." Hannah opened the door just as Matthew reached the porch. He removed his hat, revealing hair still damp from washing, and Hannah was struck again by how handsome he was in the morning light. "Good morning," she said, suddenly shy after their parting the night before. Matthew's eyes warmed as they met hers. "Good morning, Hannah." He nodded to her father. "Mr. Parker, you're looking better today." "Amazing what a good night's sleep can do," George replied. "That and seeing my daughter finally admit she doesn't hate all cattle ranchers equally." "Pa!" Hannah exclaimed, mortified. Matthew laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "I'm glad to have moved up in your estimation, sir." George waved them both to the table. "Sit down, Fletcher. Have some coffee before you two head to Millsville. Hannah, the man looks hungry, feed him." Despite her embarrassment at her father's blunt acknowledgement of her changing feelings, Hannah was touched by the easy camaraderie between the two men. As she prepared a simple breakfast of fried eggs and biscuits, she reflected on how quickly her world had changed. A week ago, Matthew Fletcher had been the arrogant neighbor she avoided. Now he was. What? A friend. Something more, the look he gave her as she set his plate before him, warm, intimate, full of promise, suggested definitely something more. After breakfast, they prepared to leave for Millsville. The meeting wasn't scheduled until evening, but they wanted to arrive early to speak with Martha Wilson and the others who had been affected by Blackwater's scheme. "Are you sure you'll be all right alone?" Hannah asked her father as they prepared to depart. George nodded. "I'll be fine. Billy's staying behind to help with the chores, and Jim said he'd send someone by to check on me midday." Matthew had arranged for 2 of his ranch hands to follow at a distance, keeping an eye on the Parker farm while they were away. It was a precaution that Hannah appreciated, though she hoped it would prove unnecessary. The journey to Millsville took most of the morning. Hannah rode beside Matthew, finding comfort in his steady presence and quiet strength. They discussed their strategy for the meeting, but also shared stories from their lives, Matthew speaking of his childhood in Texas, Hannah reminiscing about her mother's garden and her father's early attempts at teaching her to plow a straight furrow. By the time they reached Millsville, Hannah realized she'd laughed more in those few hours than she had in months. There was an ease between them now, a natural flow of conversation and companionable silences that felt as comfortable as if they'd known each other for years, instead of truly connecting only days ago. Millsville was slightly larger than Cottonwood Creek, with a proper main street boasting several shops, a hotel, and the white steepled church where the meeting would take place. They stopped first at the hotel to secure rooms for the night, one for Hannah and one for Matthew, though the knowing look from the desk clerk made Hannah blush. Martha Wilson had arranged to meet them at a small cafe near the church. She greeted them warmly, introducing them to several other farmers and ranchers who had gathered early for the meeting. "This is Elijah Brandt," she said, indicating a tall, weathered man with a shock of white hair. Blackwater tried to claim he'd sold them his apple orchard last spring. Elijah shook their hands firmly. "Almost lost 50 years of work to those snakes," he said grimly. "Would have if my son hadn't been friends with the county clerk who spotted discrepancies in the paperwork." One by one, they heard similar stories: forged signatures, threats, mysterious accidents that occurred after refusals to sell. The pattern was clear and disturbing. Blackwater targeted farms and ranches that seemed vulnerable, owned by the elderly, the ill, those without family support or financial resources to fight back. "How are they getting away with this?" Hannah asked, outraged by the scope of the fraud. "They move between counties," Martha explained. "Never stay in one place long enough for patterns to be noticed, and they're careful to cover their tracks. But if we all come forward together," Matthew pointed out, "the pattern becomes impossible to ignore." As the afternoon progressed, more people arrived for the meeting. By early evening, the church was filled to capacity, with over 50 landowners from across 3 counties. The atmosphere was charged with a mixture of anger, fear, and hope that together, they might finally find justice. The meeting was called to order by Reverend Thomas, the local minister who had offered the church as a meeting place. After an opening prayer, he turned the floor over to Martha Wilson, who had emerged as the unofficial leader of the group. Martha stood at the pulpit, her voice steady as she recounted her family's experience with Blackwater. One by one, others stood to share their stories, each one reinforcing the pattern of deceit and intimidation. When it was Hannah's turn, she felt a momentary flutter of nervousness. Public speaking had never been her strength, but as she rose, she felt Matthew's reassuring presence beside her, giving her courage. "My name is Hannah Parker," she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "My father and I own a wheat farm near Cottonwood Creek. 3 days ago, men from Blackwater Land Company arrived with a document they claimed my father had signed, selling our farm, but my father never signed anything." She detailed the threats, the fire set to their outbuilding, the intimidation tactics. As she spoke, she noticed a figure slipping into the back of the church, Sheriff Miller from Cottonwood Creek. Their eyes met briefly, and he nodded, encouraging her to continue. When Hannah finished, Matthew stood. "I'm Matthew Fletcher," he introduced himself. "I own the Flying F Ranch outside of Cottonwood Creek. Blackwater approached me last year, offering to buy my land. When I refused, I experienced a series of accidents: cut fence lines, a barn fire, cattle driven off in the night." His testimony added weight to the others, showing that Blackwater didn't just target the vulnerable, they retaliated against anyone who stood in their way. As the testimonies continued, Sheriff Miller made his way to the front of the church. When the last speaker finished, he stepped forward. "Folks," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs that had filled the church, "I'm Sheriff Daniel Miller from Cottonwood Creek. I came here tonight because Miss Parker and Mr. Fletcher brought this matter to my attention yesterday. What I've heard here is deeply disturbing." He paused, looking around the room. "I've sent telegrams to my counterparts in neighboring counties. Several have reported similar complaints about Blackwater, but none realized the extent of the operation. Based on what I've heard tonight, I believe we have enough evidence to open a formal investigation." A buzz of excitement ran through the crowd. "Additionally," Sheriff Miller continued, "I took the liberty of wiring the territorial governor's office this morning. They're sending an investigator from the land office, who should arrive by train tomorrow." Hannah exchanged a surprised look with Matthew. What had started as his bluff to Wilkins was becoming reality. The meeting concluded with the formation of a committee to gather all evidence against Blackwater and present it to the authorities. Hannah and Matthew were both asked to serve, along with Martha Wilson, Elijah Brandt, and several others. As people began to disperse, Sheriff Miller approached Hannah and Matthew. "I have some news you might find interesting," he said in a low voice. "Horace Wilkins is known to the authorities in Missouri and Oklahoma Territory, operates under different company names but the same scheme." "So he's a wanted man?" Matthew asked. "Not yet," the sheriff replied, "but he will be once all this evidence comes to light." He looked at Hannah. "In the meantime, Miss Parker, I'd advise caution. Men like Wilkins don't take kindly to being exposed." Hannah nodded, a chill running through her at the thought of Wilkins's potential retaliation. As if sensing her unease, Matthew placed a hand at the small of her back, a gesture both protective and comforting. "We'll be heading back to the Parker farm first thing tomorrow," Matthew told the sheriff. "Will you be returning to Cottonwood Creek tonight?" Sheriff Miller shook his head. "In the morning. I want to speak with the sheriff here about coordinating our efforts." After the sheriff moved on to speak with others, Matthew turned to Hannah. "It's getting late. We should get some rest before the journey back tomorrow." They walked together to the hotel, the night air cool after the stuffiness of the crowded church. Stars glittered overhead, and the sounds of the small town settling for the night surrounded them, a dog barking in the distance, the faint piano music from the saloon down the street, the creak of a rocking chair on someone's porch. At the door to Hannah's room, they paused. Matthew took her hand, his thumb tracing the calluses that spoke of her hard work on the farm. "You were magnificent tonight," he said softly. "The way you spoke, how clearly you presented the facts. You helped others find their courage." Hannah smiled, touched by his praise. "I wasn't alone. You were there beside me. And I always will be if you'll let me." The words were simple but weighted with meaning. Hannah looked up at him, at this man who had come into her life so unexpectedly, who had challenged her preconceptions and then exceeded all her expectations. In the quiet hotel hallway, with the weight of the day behind them and the uncertainty of tomorrow still ahead, she made her decision. Rising on her tiptoes, she kissed him, putting into the gesture all the feelings she wasn't yet ready to voice. Matthew responded immediately, his arms encircling her waist, drawing her closer. This kiss was different from their first, deeper, more certain, filled with promise. When they finally parted, both were breathless. Matthew rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if memorizing the moment. "I should go to my room," he murmured, "before I forget I'm supposed to be a gentleman." Hannah smiled, her heart full. "Tomorrow will be a long day. We both need rest." Matthew stepped back reluctantly. "Good night, Hannah," Good night, Matthew." As she closed her door, Hannah leaned against it, her fingers touching her lips. Outside, she could hear Matthew's footsteps moving down the hall to his own room. For the first time since the Blackwater men had appeared on their farm, she felt truly hopeful not just about saving their land, but about the future that might be waiting for her beyond this crisis. The hope was short-lived. Hannah was awakened before dawn by urgent knocking at her door. Heart pounding, she grabbed her robe and opened the door to find Matthew, fully dressed, his expression grim. "What is it?" she asked, instantly alert. "Sheriff Miller just received a telegram from his deputy in Cottonwood Creek," Matthew explained. "There was a fire at your farm last night." Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. "My father, he's safe," Matthew assured her quickly. "Billy got him out and the house is intact, but they burned your wheat fields, Hannah, all of them." The journey back to the Parker farm was a blur of anxiety and dread. They rode hard, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. By mid-afternoon, they crested the final hill overlooking the farm, and Hannah's worst fears were confirmed. Where acres of wheat had stood just yesterday, there was now only charred earth and the acrid smell of smoke. The house and barn were still standing, but the fields, their livelihood, their future, were gone. Hannah dismounted slowly, her legs numb beneath her. She walked a few steps into what had been the north field, kneeling to touch the blackened soil. Ash clung to her fingers, a gritty reminder of all they had lost. Matthew knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Hannah," he said softly, "I'm so sorry." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "Everything's gone. The harvest, our income for the year." Her voice broke. "What are we going to do?" Before Matthew could answer, Hannah's father appeared in the doorway of the house, supported by Billy. Even from a distance, Hannah could see the devastation on his face as he surveyed the ruined fields. She rose quickly, running to him. "Pa, are you all right?" George embraced her tightly. "I'm fine, daughter, just fine." But his voice was hollow, his eyes fixed on the charred remains of their wheat. "They came in the night," he said. "A dozen of them, maybe more, set fire to the fields from all sides. There was nothing we could do." Billy, his young face streaked with soot, looked ashamed. "I tried to stop them, Miss Parker, but there were too many. I had to get your pa out safe." "You did the right thing, Billy," Matthew assured him, approaching the porch. "Buildings can be rebuilt, fields replanted, people can't be replaced." Hannah was struck by the simple truth of his words. As devastating as the loss of their wheat was, her father was safe. She still had him, and for that she was grateful. Inside the house, they gathered around the kitchen table, the familiar setting a stark contrast to the destruction outside. Jim and Carlos had ridden in from Matthew's ranch upon seeing the smoke, and they joined them, offering their support and outrage at Blackwater's actions. "Sheriff Miller will be back by now," Matthew said. "I'll ride into town and bring him out here." "It won't make any difference," George said, his voice weary. "The fields are gone. Even if they arrest Wilkins and his men, it won't bring back our harvest." Hannah watched her father, seeing the defeat in his shoulders, the resignation in his eyes. This farm had been his life's work, his legacy. Now, with his health failing and their livelihood destroyed, he seemed to have lost all hope. "We'll rebuild," she said firmly, surprising herself with her own conviction. "We'll replant, winter wheat. There's still time before the first frost." George shook his head. "With what seed, Hannah? With what money? Everything we had was invested in the crop they just burned." The room fell silent as the reality of their situation sank in. Hannah felt despair creeping in, threatening to overwhelm the determination she'd just voiced. Then Matthew spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. "I have seed," he said, "and money for supplies, for hiring extra hands to get the planting done quickly." George's head snapped up. "We don't need your charity, Fletcher." "It's not charity," Matthew replied calmly. "It's an investment in your farm and your future." He paused, his eyes finding Hannah's. "In our future, if you'll have me." The room seemed to hold its breath. Hannah stared at Matthew, understanding the full weight of what he was offering, not just financial support, but a life together. "Matthew," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He rose, moving to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. "I know this isn't how or when I planned to ask," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "But life rarely follows our plans, does it?" A small smile tugged at his lips. "Hannah Parker, I love you. I think I've loved you since the first time I saw you standing in your field, looking at me like I was trespassing on your personal kingdom." Despite everything, Hannah found herself smiling at the memory. "You were trespassing," she reminded him. "Your cattle had broken through the fence." Matthew laughed softly. "So they had." His expression turned serious again. "I'm not asking you to marry me out of pity or obligation, Hannah. I'm asking because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Because when I look at you, I see everything I never knew I wanted: strength, passion, a love for the land that matches my own." Hannah was aware of the others in the room, her father, Billy, Jim, Carlos, all witnesses to this most intimate of moments. Yet somehow their presence didn't matter. There was only Matthew, his hands warm around hers, his eyes filled with love and hope. "Your fields need hands," he said softly, echoing his words from that first morning. "But my life needs yours more than wheat." Hannah's heart swelled with emotion. Just days ago, she had been determined to save her family's farm on her own, to need no one, to rely on no one. Now, faced with this man who offered not to rescue her but to stand beside her, to build a life with her, she found herself surrendering not to dependency, but to partnership. "Yes," she whispered, her voice gaining strength as she continued. "Yes, Matthew Fletcher, I will marry you, not because I need saving, but because I love you too." Matthew's face lit up with a joy so pure it took Hannah's breath away. He rose, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. Their kiss was a promise, sealed before the witnesses who had become not just allies but friends in their struggle. When they parted, Hannah turned to her father, seeking his blessing. George's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but his expression was one of contentment rather than sorrow. "I couldn't ask for a better man for my daughter," he said, his voice gruff with emotion, "or a better future for this land." The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. They moved to the window to see Sheriff Miller riding toward the house, accompanied by several deputies and a man in a city suit whom Hannah didn't recognize. Matthew squeezed her hand. "That must be the investigator from the land office," he said. "Let's see what news they bring." Outside, Sheriff Miller's expression was grim but determined as he surveyed the burned fields. "This is the final straw," he said. "We have warrants for Wilkins and his associates. Deputies are searching for them as we speak." The man in the suit introduced himself as Edward Collins, special investigator for the Territorial Land Office. "We've been tracking Blackwater's activities for some time," he explained, "but they've been careful to cover their tracks. The testimonies gathered at your meeting, combined with this," he gestured to the charred fields, "will be enough to shut them down permanently." "That won't bring back our crop," Hannah pointed out. Collins nodded sympathetically. "No, it won't. But the governor's office is prepared to offer restitution to those who have suffered damages. It won't make you whole, but it will help with rebuilding." It was more than Hannah had hoped for. Between the promise of restitution and Matthew's offer of assistance, they could replant, rebuild. The Parker farm would survive. As the men discussed the details, Hannah stepped away, walking to the edge of the burned field. The devastation was complete, but she found herself looking beyond it to the soil beneath, still rich and fertile, waiting for new seed. To the future that would grow from this scorched earth, nurtured by hard work and determination. She felt Matthew's presence before she saw him, a warmth at her back that had become familiar in such a short time. His arms encircled her waist, and she leaned into him, taking comfort in his strength. "It will be beautiful again," he promised, his breath warm against her ear. "Golden wheat stretching to the horizon, our children running through the fields, our children." The words painted a picture so vivid, so full of promise that Hannah's heart ached with longing for it. "Our children," she repeated softly, "on our land." Matthew turned her in his arms, his expression serious. "I meant what I said, Hannah. I don't want to take over your farm. I want us to build something together, my ranch, your farm, side by side. Different but united, just like us." Hannah studied his face, seeing the sincerity there. This was no empty promise, no convenient solution to their problems. This was a man who saw her as she was independent, strong-willed, devoted to her land and loved her for those very qualities. "I believe you," she said simply. Their future spread before them, as vast and full of possibility as the Kansas prairie itself. There would be challenges, of course, rebuilding the farm, bringing Wilkins and Blackwater to justice, merging their separate lives into one. But standing there in Matthew's arms, with the support of friends and family around them, Hannah knew they would face those challenges together. 3 months later, on a crisp October morning, Hannah Parker became Hannah Fletcher in a simple ceremony held on the porch of her family's farmhouse. The wheat fields, replanted with winter wheat, stretched green and promising behind them as they spoke their vows before Reverend Thomas, who had traveled from Millsville for the occasion. George Parker, still thin but growing stronger every day, gave his daughter away with tears in his eyes and joy in his heart. Jim served as Matthew's best man, while Martha Wilson, who had become a dear friend, stood as Hannah's matron of honor. The guests included not just friends and neighbors, but many of the farmers and ranchers who had stood with them against Blackwater. Their united efforts had paid off Horace Wilkins, and his associates had been arrested and were awaiting trial, their fraudulent operation exposed and dismantled. As Hannah and Matthew sealed their vows with a kiss, cheers erupted from the gathered crowd. The celebration that followed was joyous, a community coming together to honor not just a marriage, but a new beginning. Later, as twilight fell and the last guests departed, Hannah found herself standing once again at the edge of the wheat fields, Matthew by her side. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and a gentle breeze rustled the young wheat plants. "Happy?" Matthew asked, his arm around her waist. Hannah looked up at him, at the man who had changed her world in ways she could never have imagined that summer morning when he'd ridden onto their farm. "More than I thought possible," she answered truthfully. Matthew smiled, pulling her closer. "And this is just the beginning, Mrs. Fletcher." As they walked back to the house, their house now, shared with her father who would always have a home with them, Hannah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From suspicion to respect, from respect to friendship, from friendship to a love deeper and more profound than she had ever dared to dream of. The wheat fields would grow and flourish, season after season. Their lives would intertwine and expand, children would come, years would pass. But Hannah knew she would always remember this day, this moment standing on the threshold of their future, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next, together. 5 years later, Hannah stood at the window of the farmhouse, watching as Matthew played with their twin 3-year-old daughters in the yard. The little girls, with their father's dark hair and their mother's determined spirit, shrieked with laughter as Matthew pretended to be a horse, carrying them on his back across the grass. Behind them, the wheat fields stretched golden and ripe, ready for harvest, the most bountiful they'd seen in years. The Parker Fletcher farm had thrived under their joint care, becoming one of the most successful operations in the county. They'd expanded, adding cattle to the eastern pastures while maintaining the wheat fields that had been in Hannah's family for generations. George Parker, now a beloved grandfather, sat in a rocking chair on the porch, watching the scene with contentment. His health had improved significantly over the years, though he no longer worked the fields himself. Instead, he kept the books for both the farm and Matthew's ranch, his mind for figures as sharp as ever. Hannah's hand drifted to her rounded belly, where their third child, a boy, she suspected grew stronger every day. Life had blessed them abundantly, with love, family, and prosperity born from the ashes of near disaster. As if sensing her gaze, Matthew looked up, his face breaking into the smile that still made her heart skip a beat. He whispered something to the girls, who immediately ran toward the porch and their grandfather, leaving Matthew free to approach the house. He entered the kitchen, crossing to where Hannah stood, and wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands coming to rest protectively over hers on her belly. "What has you looking so thoughtful, my love?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. Hannah leaned back against him, drawing strength and comfort from his solid presence. "I was just thinking about how far we've come, how different things might have been if you hadn't ridden onto our farm that day." Matthew chuckled. "If I recall correctly, you weren't exactly thrilled to see me." "I was wrong about so many things," Hannah admitted, turning in his arms to face him. "About you, about what it means to be strong, about what I needed in my life." "We were both wrong," Matthew said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear in a gesture that had become familiar over the years. "I thought I needed land success to rebuild what my family had lost, but what I really needed was you." Hannah smiled, remembering his words from that first day, words that had seemed so strange at the time but had proven profoundly true. "Your fields need hands," she quoted softly. Matthew's eyes warmed with recognition and love. "My life needs yours more than wheat," he finished, lowering his lips to hers in a kiss that held all the passion, tenderness, and commitment that had defined their journey together. Outside, their daughter's laughter mingled with George's deeper chuckle, the sounds of family and happiness floating on the Kansas breeze. Inside, in the circle of each other's arms, Hannah and Matthew reaffirmed the truth they had discovered on that summer day 5 years ago, that love, like wheat, required nurturing, patience, and faith. That it could weather storms, survive drought, and emerge stronger for having endured. And that when harvested with care and gratitude, it yielded the most precious crop of all a life shared, season after season, until the end of their days.